So Courtney, do you want to introduce or me before we get into it?
I can introduce. So welcome everyone to March's Political Education segment. We are talking about abortion access and history and the current landscape of abortion access. I'd like to note that this is particularly U.S. Focused and centered, but abortion access throughout the world is an issue. But yeah, and then we'll have a few asks for you that Georgia previewed, and you'll get repeats on how to fundraise for abortion. Next slide.
Yeah, we're gonna have to.
Yeah, just tell me next slide when you.
Yeah.
Yeah, so before we get into the topic, which is, by the way, probably my favorite topic in the world besides cats and socialism, but just wanted to kind of get like a baseline set that when we are talking about abortion care, we are doing so while recognizing that people of all genders access abortion care. It's important to bring that up because I think that we quote some of the law, and the law says woman because it's old school. And I just want everyone right off the bat that we use gender neutral language when we're talking about abortion care because everyone accesses abortions. And also when we are talking about restrictions to abortion access, particularly, we talk a lot about Pennsylvania, Ohio, and West Virginia because we are a healthcare desert in this area. We're doing so while acknowledging that the restrictions to care disproportionately impact BIPOC and LGBTQ plus communities. And basically all kinds of marginalized folks and people of different abilities are impacted more so. Another thing that we want to set the tone with is that we are unapologetic about abortion access as socialists. Abortion is healthcare, and we want everyone to say the word abortion. In fact, let's do that right now. I want everybody at the count of, I'm going to count to 3, 2, 1, and then everyone just say the word abortion because it's a totally normal word. So 3, 2, 1.
Abortion.
Thank you. I love that. That was beautiful. So yeah, don't be afraid to say the word. If you want to say abortion access, say that too, because it basically means the same thing. But don't treat it like it's this bad thing. It's normal. It's just as normal as miscarriages and other kinds of pregnancy outcomes, including delivery and all of the complications that can come with pregnancy and delivery as well. All of that is normal. Another thing that we do in doing that is we fight the silo effect. And what I mean by this, because I go on about this a lot, if you know me, but a lot of times, especially with liberal feminism, abortion is often treated like its own issue. So as a socialist feminist, I am here to say that is not its own issue. It is connected to everything. It is an issue of bodily autonomy. It is involved housing. It involves gender violence, state violence, and just anything that you can think of, it is involved in. And I think it's important to connect with all those issues and not treat it like it's its own thing. Another important thing is that it always involves birth control. Not only because it is a method of birth control, but the same people who oppose abortion access also impose other birth control options. And I don't know if everyone always realizes that. So it's really important to acknowledge that when we're talking about abortion and people who are trying to take that access away from people, they also want people to lose access to different birth control methods and family planning methods as well, including like things like STI testing. And just for full disclosure, I work for Planned Parenthood. So I obviously, I guess you could say I'm biased, but I think it's just important to disclose that. I do work in an abortion clinic in Pittsburgh. And so does Courtney, my comrade. She also works for Planned Parenthood as well. So we are coming at you with that kind of insider perspective and information, hoping to connect what is often a liberal feminist issue with socialist issues. Next slide. I think this is me too, actually, as well. I mean, this is pretty much what I was mostly saying, is that it goes along with everything. Just some really normalizing statistics that I always like to tell my patients is it's one of the safest medical procedures that you can get. It's safer than getting a tooth pulled. It's safer than a colonoscopy. And it's actually more likely that you will get struck by lightning than have a serious complication during an abortion. It's a 1 in 30,000 chance that you'll get struck by lightning, and it is a 1 in 100,000 chance that you will have a serious complication during abortion. So it is very normal, very regular, very safe. Next slide.
Hey, this is me. Most of this presentation will focus on post-Roe because that's in the US is pretty significant, but I did want to give some context for abortion access and what abortion access looked like pre-1973 with the passage of Roe v. Wade. So ever since people were around on the earth, people have been finding ways and looking for ways to prevent and to terminate unintended pregnancies. So abortion is nothing new. In fact, in Europe, abortion was a medically accepted practice until the 1800s and only discussed as a matter of male property rights, which is interesting. And then first made illegal in the United States in 1821. One thing that I think is incredibly interesting too is that, like he says here, like around 20 to 25% of pregnancies in the 1800s ended in abortion, which is which is really high. So I think that just goes to show like how ubiquitous the procedure was and how more frankly accessible it was. And then when we first start to see, even though we first see it illegal in Connecticut, like the first big wave of like restrictions that we see, and we see this around like not just like abortion care, but lots of things having to do with reproduction, were in 1873 when the Comstock laws passed, which prohibited the dissemination of information about abortion, but also about birth control and sex toys through the Postal Service, which was how a lot of information was spread and was like really, in my opinion, like super bad public health policy to not allow information on people's bodies to be like publicly available and accessible. And then by that time became like a state-by-state case of allowing legality of abortion access. So by the time Roe v. Wade passes, hits the Supreme Court, only 4 states had it legal in their state constitutions. Interestingly, Alaska, Hawaii, New York, and Washington. Alaska is always super surprising to people, but I think it's because they're like trying to be different in the like Western frontier sort of space too. Next slide. Roe v. Wade. This is what everyone thinks about when they think about what determines abortion access in the United States. And to be clear, it is like incredibly important at the time, but it doesn't take anti-abortion zealots long before they start finding mechanisms to chip away at abortion access. I think a key thing to say about Roe v. Wade is that under the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment, which people have found other ways to like obstruct and obtain access without technically violating the Due Process Clause. I also think it's important too that because the Roe v. Wade decision has like been key, the Privacy Clause in particular has been key to and upholding lots of other key Supreme Court decisions, like around LGBTQ rights in particular. So the other thing I will say about Roe v. Wade before we go to the next slide is that Roe v. Wade, like, again, is, in my opinion, the floor, not the ceiling. When it comes to abortion access, as we know, Roe v. Wade is still law of the land. Abortion is still technically legal, but operating from a legality framework instead of like an accessibility framework, which I think we're more used to, like a better way and like as socialists how we should be thinking about it, like actually hampers abortion access, right? Like Roe v. Wade only guarantees that abortion is legal, does not say anything about accessibility. So in many parts of this country, many parts of the state even, it is like Roe v. Wade never happened, like because of because of how far you have to travel to get to an abortion provider, and some of the things we'll talk about in the next slide. Can we go to the next slide? The Hyde Amendment. So this is like, the Hyde Amendment is like straight up just like racist and deadly, and has cost people their lives disproportionately, Black and brown folks in this country, their lives. So what the Hyde Amendment has done in 1976, what this does is it has prevented federal funding through Medicaid, Medicare, or through any government employees' healthcare. This also includes like veterans, and also includes folks who live on Native lands and access healthcare through like the Indian healthcare services. Bars the federal the use of those monies to be paying for abortion care, except in these very extreme instances to save the life of a pregnant person, or in cases of rape or incest. Again, this disproportionately impacts BIPOC folks and low-income people who are seeking abortion care. This is like straight up cause people to die because they simply cannot afford and have enough money to pay for necessary health care. Next slide. Planned Parenthood v. Casey. This is also super important, also really important to us in Pennsylvania. This was a case that originated out of Pennsylvania from our now Senator Robert Casey's father, who signed into law the Abortion Control Act, which limited abortion on several key things, and many of those things are still in law, including a sex-selective abortion ban that disproportionately targets Black and brown folks. But what Planned Parenthood v. Casey did, which was like incredibly important for us to talk about, as far as like how it paints and continues to shape the current of access to abortion care, is Planned Parenthood v. Casey is where the undue burden test is first administered, and it continues to be used as standard to say whether or not a restriction is okay or not. Does decimating access in a state to the fact that there's only one abortion provider in the state, is that an undue burden? Does like your federal government provided insurance program like Medicaid not paying for your access to healthcare, is that an undue burden? That's kind of where the standard has come in, and this has been the case that has allowed a lot of that stuff to happen, basically allowing the courts and legislature to decide whether or not things are undue burdens, and if basically a bunch of like white men don't believe that they are an undue burden for people accessing care, then they become law and become further impediments to care. And since then, we've seen drastic decreases in the number of abortion providers. In Pennsylvania, for example, we are now down to 17 abortion providers throughout the state. To give you context, around the time that Roe v. Wade first passed, we had over 140 abortion providers, which it really demonstrates the lack of access we have and the dire need we have to provide care. Next slide. Whole Women v. Hellerstedt. This is important to talk about. This was largely seen as a victory, although I think we will see what happens with the newest Supreme Court arrangement if this gets overturned. The Whole Women v. Hellerstedt in the summer of 2016, basically the Supreme Court ruled that Texas cannot place restrictions on the delivery of abortion care that created an undue burden for women seeking an abortion. Most of the laws that they are talking about in Whole Women v. Hellerstedt have to do with trap laws, and Crystal's going to talk a little bit more about trap laws in a second. But these are like, you know, insidious ways that anti-abortion zealots will put into law to try and limit access to care by placing onerous, unnecessary, and burdensome restrictions and regulations on abortion providers in order to like limit the number of facilities and health centers providing abortion. Crystal will go into some of the details later, but you'll see things like, you know, they need to have hallways wide enough that 2 gurneys can pass through, which is like, you know, if you are only providing medical abortion care, like medical abortion care up to like 11 weeks of pregnancy, like it's not like ever a thing that needs to happen, but we'll still have those restrictions imposed with the intent not to keep people who access abortion or not to keep anyone safe, but with the intent that they know that like yeah, I think one of the things too that we often hear with Whole Woman v. Hellerstedt is why did this not reverse all trap laws across the US when Whole Woman v. Hellerstedt was decided? It's because states have slightly different trap laws state to state. So what part of the sucky thing of this also is that it created a thing where like each state would have to challenge their each individual trap laws in order to get them reversed. Given the current makeup of the Supreme Court, there's some hesitancy to really challenge that. There's some cases that are up now that could really mean danger when it comes to abortion access. And some folks think it could mean the undoing of Roe, although in my completely cynical opinion, you do not just look at this country now, you don't need to like undo Roe in order to decimate access. Like you just need to like.
How you doing, sweetheart?
What?
That was someone else.
Oh, sorry. But yeah, you don't need to undo Roe in order to completely decimate access to care. Yeah, I think you just need to keep increasing the standard of what an undue burden is until it's an undue burden. I'm gonna kick it to Crystal for the rest of it.
Yeah, so just a couple examples of trap laws. I know that Courtney just said a bunch of them. I'm not going to read this slide word for word. You can just see all of them are targeting abortion providers because that's what trap law stands for. They're targeted regulations against abortion providers. And then some of these even go down to like the nitty gritty of like what pain meds we can even offer patients. So a lot of it is just punishing abortion providers, punishing abortion workers, and then also punishing the patients. This brings up the idea of what is an undue burden. And, you know, we're currently living in a society where our legislators don't think driving hundreds and hundreds of miles to a doctor's appointment is an undue burden, because ultimately that's what these trap laws lead to, is they close down clinics, and that's what they do. They're the most common form of abortion legislation recently, other than the Roe laws that are supposed to go into effect if Roe is ever overturned, but those don't really do anything right now. But yeah, I mean, if they can't get rid of Roe v. Wade, then what they could do is they can shut down abortion providers, and they've been incredibly successful. And there are other regulations as well that really tie into how abortion access is related to other issues. Like, part of my job as an abortion care worker is I schedule people's appointments, and I make sure that they're able to access those appointments. And in Pennsylvania, there is a 24-hour waiting period where you have to have a phone call with a doctor where they have to tell you that things like the father has to pay child support is the language in their script that they are forced to read, and the patient has to sign off on, and then they have to come in for their appointment. And often I find that I have patients who can't get 2 days off work or they'll get fired. So all of these little things that we have to, you know, just obstacles that we have to overcome, it's just related to everything. And ultimately what it does is it hurts families and it hurts communities and it hurts our neighborhoods and everybody in it. Next slide. Reproductive justice. What does this have to do with abortion access? I love this term, and I feel like everybody needs to familiarize with themselves with this term. I know we're all really used to reproductive rights, but reproductive justice is different. First of all, it was coined by a member of Sister Song Women of Color, I believe in the 1970s or 1980s, in one of those 2 decades. And the reason they came up with this term is because the idea of pro-choice is not adequate for people of color in the United States, because a lot of times due to racism, due to state violence, due to our carceral systems, they don't have choice like a lot of wealthier white people do when it comes to building families and building a place to live. So reproductive justice is meant to encompass the fact that the racism in the United States does limit choice, making that term inadequate for people of color. So the term itself, reproductive justice, is supposed to be a framework that addresses how race, gender, class, ability, nationality, and sexuality intersect. And it's not just related to abortion access, though it's often talked about in abortion access. It has to do with housing, it has to do with police violence. I mean, almost everything is a reproductive justice issue. Environmentalism and the climate as well, because we are supposed to be able to have, in an ideal world, choice to raise our families or build our families however we want them in a safe and sustainable environment. And all of these things that are important to socialists, such as ability and money and gender and race and ability, or I think I already said ability choice, but either in the environment, all of these things go together and factor in how people control their bodies and how they build families and where and how they live. I mean, it all goes together. So reproductive justice is a beautiful term to encompass all of that. Oh yeah, thank you. I didn't realize you were coming in. All right, next slide. Sorry, my neighbor came in to get an egg. But so how can socialists engage in reproductive justice work? So a lot of this is harking back to what I was saying at the beginning of the segment, where as socialists, we need to recognize and normalize reproductive health care, including abortion, when we talk about Medicare for all. I know that we talk about Medicare for all a lot in many different venues, and healthcare for all is a hot topic, but in the same breath in which you talk about Medicare for all and universal healthcare, you should also acknowledge that it needs to include all other repro health care, including miscarriage management, abortions, pregnancy care, postpartum care, all of that. And the rhetoric that we use is also really important, because we are coming from this era where people got really comfy cozy saying things like, safe, accessible, and rare, or something like that. But honestly, that stuff is stigmatizing. We don't want to use stigmatizing language. We want free, legal, and safe abortions, and we don't want to wait. They want them on demand, and we want them without apology. This is language that socialists should be using. We should also be defending the existing laws. I think that this gets a little bit complicated because of what Courtney said when she was talking about the history, is there's actually a lot of abortion legislation that doesn't work for us. Planned Parenthood v. Casey, allowing the undue burden venue of approaching abortion law, it didn't help. So it's way, way more than just defending existing laws, is that we actually have to push for better things. An example of this is that a lot of people always want to defend the buffer zone. Defend the buffer zone in front of clinics, defend the buffer zone in front of clinics. But what I want as an abortion care worker is I want to expand the buffer zone. I want more. I don't want to defend what we have. I want more. I want better. And I think that all socialists should be asking for that as well. And then mitigate the negative effects of abortion restrictions, particularly for low-income patients. This is a really long fight that we are going to have in this country for, full abortion access. And what we can do as socialists is mitigate those negative effects. So, we talked about how the Hyde Amendment is racist. We talked about how Medicaid not covering things impacts marginalized people. So we can try to lessen those effects. And that's what a lot of mutual aid groups like abortion funds do, is they try to redistribute wealth in a way that really benefits families. and that's why we support them. And we just support all services that benefit families in general, abortion being one of those things. And next slide. I think it might be Bree. Yeah. Bree, it's your turn.
Oh shit, okay. Your voice was very soothing. So speaking of mutual aid and providing support, one of the earliest abortion funds was established in 1981, and abortion funds do exist, and these provide funding not just for the procedure, but support for other logistical costs, things like transportation, things like lodging, things like childcare costs. And the abortion fund through mutual aid can help demonstrate the power of small dollar grassroots donations to fund our neighbors' access to healthcare. Next slide. Speaking of abortion funding, so Georgia showed off some of the nice swag that you can get. So we've partnered with the Western PA Fund for Choice this year for our local abortion fund to fundraise. And there are two ways to help us fundraise this year. One is by joining the fundraising team, Won't You Fund My Abortion, and the links should be available on those slides. So you can join our fundraising team, and you can buy tickets to our trivia fundraising event next Friday, the 26th at 7 p.m. And that's it.
Yeah, so that's pretty much everything. And the main thing that I hope everyone can take away from this is that one way that we can help as socialists is by helping abortion patients by supporting abortion funds as mutual aid, just like Bree just talked about. Mm-hmm. So we hope that you can donate and join us.